Chapter 14. Poverty Makes a Bargain. My grandmother was aging fast. She still read from the Quran each day, and latterly had taken to accusing my mother of trying to get her another husband. She would mumble that nobody wanted her anymore, that her money would soon be finished, and that once my mother had married again, she would never be allowed to see her grandchildren. She wallowed in self-pity, refusing to listen when my mother explained that she had not the slightest intention of remarrying. She shouted everything out in her loud voice for the whole neighbourhood to hear. One day she bellowed to the widow, who was passing the door, to come up and drink coffee with her, while she told her all her troubles. The widow, being a kindly soul, forgot the many times my grandmother had snubbed her almost out of existence and declared herself willing to drink coffee. She entered the house saying that she never drank good coffee unless she drank it in our house. "Where do you get the sugar?" she sighed, but my grandmother did not enlighten her and probably heard only part of the conversation in any case. Although it was the widow who had been invited to partake of refreshment, it was she who made it, my grandmother roaring instructions at her, scarcely pausing for her breath, insisting on the best cups being used. In a very short time the whole street knew that coffee was being brewed in her house, and very soon too they were going to hear that the family was practically destitute. Wood was added to the great white stove, and armchairs drawn forward for the two women. I hovered uncertainly in the background and, no notice being taken of me, finally sat down on the soft, warm carpet. The widow was delighted with her good luck and showed no inclination to leave this cosy room. My grandmother started to tell her that we had no money left, but the widow paid little attention to this, since she herself had never known anything else but a lack of money. When she finally got a chance to talk, she said cheerfully, "But you have a sewing machine, Hanum Effendi. With a sewing machine you can never be hungry." "Why, I have eaten my bread from one for the last 15 years. "Nonsense," said my grandmother. "How can I learn to use a sewing machine at my time of life?" "What about your daughter-in-law?" yelled the widow, drawing closer to the crackling fire. "Sevke?" said my grandmother in great surprise. "Why, she is as useless as I am." "No, she isn't," contradicted the widow. "Look how quickly she learned how to make the children's clothes." "Yes," said my grandmother thoughtfully. "Of course she does the most exquisite embroidery." "Embroidery," snorted the widow with great disdain. "That's no use today in the world, Hanum Effendi. But machining, that's quite another thing. Perhaps my patron in the Kapala Jarsha, the Grand Bazaar, would give her some work to do. I shall ask him tomorrow, and if he is agreeable, I shall help her and show her how to do the things he wants." "You are unusually kind," said my grandmother wonderingly, and the widow looked pleased. In the midst of her talking, my mother came in, looking so odd, so dishevelled, that my heart gave a lurch of fear. "What is wrong?" cried the widow in dismay, and my mother replied in the new, hard voice that she always seemed to use nowadays. "I'm past wondering what is right and what is wrong. To live nowadays is to bear insults from everyone. At the government departments they treat us like vermin, or tell us how fortunate we are that we have been given a man to the war. I hunt bread each day, running from one baker's shop to another. In the end, what do I get? A piece of hard, black bread that I would be ashamed to feed the animals. The crowds push and kick and snarl with rage, and all decency seems to be gone from humanity." Her voice broke, and I thought she was going to cry, but she controlled herself, a faint furrow appearing between her delicate brows, almost as though she was wondering what she was talking about. She put out a hand to steady herself, and her face became very white, deathly white, so that the cheekbones were thrown into high relief, and the nose appeared more pinched and sharper. "Did anything unusual happen this morning?" roared my grandmother. "Plenty," retorted my mother. "When you are a woman and alone in the world, you have to grow used to insults. This morning I tried several shops for bread, and in the end I found one open, and joined a queue to take my chance with the rest. Just as I handed my money and had taken the bread offered to me, a woman beside me snatched it from my hand, saying that it was hers and that she had given her money first. I snatched it back again, and so battle started. She was like a wild animal. She fought and kicked and screamed and pulled my veil from my face, saying only the rich wore veils and that I had no right to queue for bread when the poor needed it worse than I did. My veil, my mother repeated, horrified. Before all those people, she pulled aside my veil as if I was a prostitute, and then she called me one. Me, in front of all those people. I thought the world would fall on top of me. I tried to get away from her, but she had hold of my skirt, and I was afraid she would tear that from me too. 2 men interfered and gave me back the bread, and I ran away from that dreadful place, with my veil all torn and the people shouting after me in the streets. They thought I was a bad woman, that I had been fighting with another bad woman. Oh, such disgrace. To think I should live to see this day, that I should fight for such a thing. And she held up the piece of dry, black bread. Then she swayed forward, and before I had time to properly realise what was happening, she was lying across the sofa, lifted there by the strong, kindly arms of the widow. My grandmother, more agile than I ever remember seeing her, was chafing her wrists, her own face almost as white as my mother's. My mother commenced to grind her teeth, and I was terrified she was going to break them, but the widow jammed a spoon between her lips, raising her head to settle cushions more firmly behind it. After a while, the awful grinding stopped. My mother opened her eyes. "Cognac!" shouted my grandmother, busying herself making strong coffee. She was almost crying to herself, calling upon the names of her dead sons to come back and defend their women. Her weak, long pent-up tears rolled down her cheeks and fell into the hot ash of the mangal, making strange little sizzling sounds. My mother opened her eyes and sat up, the colour fast returning to her face. She stretched herself languidly, as though she were very tired and had come back from a long way away. Then she accepted coffee, and presently seemed perfectly normal again. The widow remained with us for the rest of the day. If she had work to do, she gave no hint. Good soul that she was, she only wished to stay with my mother to serve her as best she could. Dusk came early, and Ezan was read from the little mosque, the signal for my grandmother to start praying. Every evening she waited for the muezzin to climb into the minaret, for since her deafness, this was the only way she could remember the right time to pray. That evening she prayed in her loud, rumbling voice for her sons who were dead, for my grandfather, for my mother, and for us children. She put in a special little bit for herself at the end. Her voice filled the room, the old, liquid words falling softly on the ear. The widow had prepared the evening meal, and because my mother was still not really well enough to go downstairs, we had it in the salon. The fire blazed merrily, and all the lamps, oh, rash extravagance, were brightly lit. After dinner was over, my grandmother illogically wished to visit the little mosque to pray, and said she wanted me with her. We started out into the black night. I pleasantly fearful and excited. My grandmother carried a little candle in a sort of storm lantern, and I could clearly see another candle glowing on the tomb of the holy man. We walked swiftly, for the night was bitterly cold, and, when we came abreast of the window in which rested the tomb, my grandmother sternly bade me pray for the soul of the holy man. She opened her hands to the sky, palms upwards in the Muslim fashion, and I did the same thing. I do not think I said much of a prayer, for my teeth were chattering with the cold, and the wind had chosen just that moment to come whistlingly, icily around the corner, cutting through my thin coat. When we went into the mosque, we sat down on the women's side, and I was immediately acutely embarrassed, for my grandmother insisted on saying her prayers aloud. There were only a few other people there, but no peace was given to them, for, whether they wished it or not, they had to listen to my grandmother. Again and again she exhorted her God to be merciful to her dead ones, and to make my mother well and strong again. I wriggled with impatience, trying to quieten her, but she refused to be quiet until she had finished what she had come here to say. One day my mother and I went to Beşiktaş, some distance from our home. I have forgotten the reason we went, but remember the occasion, for it was the first time I had ever seen the Sultan, Mehmed Rezat. In the main street of Beşiktaş, soldiers were marching, and a band played military music, whilst the police were roughly keeping the curious crowds from the royal route. We waited to see the Sultan, and the cavalry came first, mounted on their high-stepping Arab horses. As far as I can remember, they wore blue jackets with brightly shining brass buttons, scarlet trousers, and great tall kalpaks on their heads with flowering white plumes. They pranced towards us, their uniforms making a splash of welcome colour in all that drab humanity, and their spurs clinked and jingled and gleamed in the watery sun. A carriage came after the cavalry, drawn by the elegant, aristocratic horses, and, dimly, from the windows, we caught a glimpse of an old small man with a little white beard. He was in uniform, many medals marching across his breast. A great, loyal cry went up from the people, half of them in rags, a deep-throated, rumbling roar of welcome. Padishamim Chokyasha, they roared, and then he was past us, and other voices took up the refrain. Even when the carriage had finally disappeared from sight, the echoes of the cheering crowds came back to us. Then the quiet streets grew quieter, for the people had dispersed, and my mother and I continued our journey. She had found work to do in these days. The widow, true to her word, had obtained sewing for her from her patron in Kabbalah Sharsha. The money was pitifully small, and nowadays the salon was internally littered with made and unmade work, and the never-ceasing whir of the sewing machine dominated all else. So the winter of 1915 passed to the sound of my mother's machine, and the merry, comforting, crackling sound of the logs in the china stove. Somehow or other life was readjusting itself, and we'd become used to bad food and not enough of it. My grandmother did the marketing, and I now hunted for bread. But the soft, early days of spring changed all that again. One had already learned that security was a fragile thing, sensitive to the first cold breath, yet one could not learn to accept this with finality. That spring of 1916 overrides all other memories and carries its scars to this day. Sewing for my mother came to a sudden abrupt end, for the patron of the Kapala Sharsha explained that there was no more work for anyone, that the government had bought all the available materials for the army. He said that an army sewing depot had been opened behind the Gulhane Parka, and that anyone applying there would be given work to do. He had stretched his large, hairy hands to them, begging them to understand his position, and the women had looked at each other and wondered what to do. The widow said immediately that she, for one, would go to the army depot, declaring that it was all the same to her where she worked as long as she got money for it. My mother and many of the new poor were uncertain. They felt to work in the privacy of their own homes was one thing, but to expose themselves in a government factory, quite another. When my mother came home, my grandmother looked with surprise at her empty hands and asked what was wrong. "No more work," declared my mother. "The army have bought all materials and have opened a factory behind the Gulhane Parka. The widow has gone there today to look for work." "Well, you will not," roared my grandmother so loudly that a pile of plates on the kitchen table vibrated slightly. "What is the use of talking like that?" demanded my mother wearily. "You have so little money, and the children must be fed. Can we see them going hungry because of our pride?" My grandmother stood up and called to us to come with her. She led the way into the bedroom, produced a key from somewhere about her middle, and unlocked the tin chest where her valuables were stored. "We have these 5 gold coins left to us," she said to my mother. "Take them. They will keep us for a little longer. And when they have gone, I still have my jewellery, my rings and my emerald pendant. I was keeping them for Miraz." She drew them out of her silk-lined box. They glittered palely in her hands. "No," said my mother. "These rings will never be sold. The dealers will rob you nowadays because they know that people like us are selling our valuables because we want money so desperately. Why, only last week I heard from one of the women at the Kapala Sharsha that she sold a diamond and ruby chain far finer than these, mother, and all she got for them was a little gold. She did not know their value, and when she was so hungry that she let them go, the first Jew dealer who offered to take them." "No," she said more softly. So softly that my grandmother could not catch her words. "These shall belong to Miraz's." And she touched the pretty trinklets taking them from my grandmother and locking them up again. She put her hands on my grandmother's shoulders, lightly brushing her forehead with her lips. "All our pretty things are gone," she said into the straining ears. "Let us keep Miraz's pretty things. They will look very well one day on my daughter's neck." So the first crisis was averted. The little house grew silent again, without the weight of the machine's noise to disturb it, and gold in the pocket gave a temporary, transient gaiety, for would it not buy good meals again, even for a brief while, and wine for my grandmother? Feckless and improvident and wildly extravagant were they, ignorant of the long years still to be lived. All through my childhood, their beauty and tears and gallantry pierced my heart to torment. Their blood ran fiercely through my veins, and I have been as wildly improvident, but without their courage and wit and graciousness to face the sort of heartaches they faced. Now and then the widow would come visit us, amusing yet terrifying us with her coarse humour of what life was like in a factory. She had to stay there day and night, sleeping and eating with the others, doing different turns of duty, and only allowed off one day in a week. The pay, she said, was poor, but sufficient for her, for the army provided her food. "Me," she said proudly, "I'm as strong as a lion, thank God. Only the strong can survive in a place like that." She no longer pressed my mother to join her there, realizing my grandmother's fierce distaste for such work, but since they talked openly to her, she could not help knowing that money was low again, and perhaps she knew too that it was only a matter of time before my mother joined her of her own free will. When has money not been low in my dear idiotic family? They were excellent for spending, but terrible for saving, and even life at its most cruel could not teach them anything else. One morning my grandmother went round all the rooms, ticking off on her fingers all the largest and, to my mind, the ugliest pieces of furniture we had. Several times she wondered aloud how much they would fetch if she sold them. "It's good walnut furniture," she would mutter, "not to be bought anywhere today." And Sevke was quite right when she said that these rooms are very overcrowded. Brave soul that she was trying to convince herself that the sale of her furniture was a matter of no importance. She was hoping to defer the day when my mother would have to go to the factory. She sent for a Jewish dealer, and it was I who ushered him into the transformed presence of my grandmother. She had dressed herself up for the occasion and wore all her rings and her emerald pendant, defying the dealer to guess she was desperate for money. The Jew looked over the furniture with a cautious, jaundiced eye. Perhaps he did not know what to make of the situation. For though the house was small and in a bad district, the old lady wore diamonds that he could see were real enough. She was dressed in silk too, the hallmark of respectability, and the furniture and carpets were the best that money could buy. He can be forgiven if he did not quite know how he stood in this place before the indomitable, proud-faced old woman. He ran his fingers over the smooth, polished wood, hemming and hawing, and I trailed after him, a curious figure no doubt in my assortment of colours. I had been put into the best clothes that could be found to fit me, and I was afraid to sit down for everything was uncomfortably tight, the seams in danger of giving way. The Jew rapped out a figure, and my grandmother's knuckles whitened over her ebony stick. "Are you mad?" she demanded imperiously, her loud, self-conscious voice booming reverberatingly through the room. The Jew looked doubtful again, and ran his fingers over the wood for a second time, and opened a few drawers as well. "My offer stands," he said. My grandmother drew herself up with great haughtiness. "Then I think we have nothing further to discuss," she said with an edge to her voice, and made a movement towards the door. "Wait a moment," said the Jew, adding, "Offend him," uncertainly, for he was still unsure of her status, more importantly, her financial position. There was a long pause, each eyeing the other suspiciously, each trying to assess the obstinacy of the other. The Jew shifted his eyes first, and slightly raising his figure, very slightly mind you, but that was where he made his first mistake. My grandmother remained immovable, not a flicker of emotion crossing her poker face. I was entranced, for I had never seen her like this in my grandfather's day. I had almost forgotten she could look like this. She leaned on her stick and waited, the Jew slightly raising the figure, for he knew a good bargain when he saw one, and was prepared to give way a little. But she just stood there like a statue and refused to give in. When at last he could bear it no longer, he burst out, "I'm offering you the best price you will get anywhere. If you're in need of the money, I advise you to take it." And that was the second mistake, for it made my grandmother arrogant. And when she was arrogant, she was at her most dangerous, and better people than the Jew had been known to grow reckless under this danger. "When I am in need of money," she said, "I shall no doubt be willing to let you cheat me. At the moment, I am merely trying to get rid of the large furniture for, as you can see, this house is far too small to house it. If, however, you do not wish to buy, then that is quite a different matter, and I can only regret that we have both wasted our time. Good morning." And she walked determinedly towards the door, holding it open for the Jew to pass through. We heard him going down the stairs, and I wanted to cry with desperation, for perhaps my grandmother would never again get such an offer. I looked at her mutely, longing to cry, but I heard the Jew's returning step on the stairs, and I looked at my grandmother, who had not heard. I was afraid she would make some false remark he would overhear, and which would send him bounding out of our house, or to return with a lower offer. But she said nothing, and showed no trace of surprise when he came back into the salon. He sketched a gesture on the air of desperation, of resignation, who shall know? And he took a deep breath, saying, "You're ruining me, Effendi, and I shall never be able to get rid of such heavy, old-fashioned stuff as this. But here's my final figure. Take it or leave it." And he named a sum, and my grandmother's mouth relaxed. "Add 20 liras more," she said grandly, "and the furniture is yours." "5," said the dealer. "15," said my grandmother. "7.5," shouted the dealer, perspiring by now and looking as if he would like to discontinue, but could not, because he loved a good bargain too. "12.5," retorted my grandmother, indomitable to the last. "10," said the dealer, passing his hand over his brow. "Very well," conceded my grandmother, and the Jew handed over a greasy bundle of liras and went to the window to call up his porters, who had been waiting in case business was done. He walked back to my grandmother. "You drive a hard bargain," he said, "but if you ever want to sell those diamonds and things of yours, I can put you onto a man who will give you a good price for them." "Thank you," said my grandmother with distaste, anxious to be rid of him now that the business was concluded. "My jewellery is never likely to be for sale." She sat down on the sofa and waited for the porters to clear the rooms. She called out constant instructions to them and warnings to be careful of her carpets, and made them remove their footwear before they entered the rooms. When at last they and the furniture had gone, I saw that she was trembling violently. "What is it, grandmother?" I asked, going over to her. "Nothing," she says. "Only happiness that I am an old woman, have been able to get the price I wanted out of the Jew." And she pulled me down beside her, and there was a great ripping, tearing sound from under me. We looked at each other in dismay, then suddenly burst out laughing, for the trousers, unable to bear the strain, had finally given way. "Never mind," comforted my grandmother, "we shall buy you some more. See, we have plenty of money again." And she held up the greasy liras triumphantly, then carelessly threw them on a little inlaid table. After handling those, she shouted happily, "My hands need washing." And she stumped downstairs to the kitchen, from where presently came the merry splashing sound of water running. When she came back up to the salon again, she took the eau de cologne to fastidiously sprinkle over her palms and said to me, "Always remember, never let anyone know when you are desperate. Put your best clothes on and pride on your face, and you can get anything in this world." "Why?" I wanted to know. "Because otherwise you will get nothing but kicks," she roared. "If that Jew had known how desperate I was, he would have succeeded in beating me down to his own price. As it was, I succeeded in beating him. Why? She continued complacently. He even complimented me on my jewellery, and she patted the emerald pendant affectionately. Your grandfather always had very good taste and only bought the best. She took off the flashing lovely pendant and all the rings from her fingers, and they lay gleaming in the palm of her hand with the lively, separate life. Now I shall lock them away again, she said to me. The next person to wear them will be your sister. He was going to be a great beauty one day. My mother came in from market with Mehmet clinging to her. What are you dressed up for? She asked my grandmother suspiciously. Look, commanded my grandmother, pointing to the half-empty salon. My mother's eyes flickered a little. Then she turned back to my grandmother and said in an ordinary, normal, conversational sort of voice, It's a great improvement. It was time to clear the room of all that heavy old furniture. And her eyes met my grandmother's and held for a moment, and they both smiled. My mother pushed a chair to a different position, standing back to see the effect. Oh, decidedly better, she said merrily, and I was immeasurably touched by her gallantry, and by my grandmother's too, for neither of them broke down to weep that half their home was gone. Instead, they stood in the salon and tried different arrangements with the furniture that was left, and pretended that they had sold because the room was not big enough to house everything. And young as I was, my heart swelled with pride. Then my mother caught sight of my burst trousers and the bare skin showing through, and she said, laughing at me, that she hoped that this had not happened whilst the Jew was here. No, indeed, said my grandmother energetically. If it had, I would have slapped his backside hard, for that bit of bare skin might have cost me 50 liras or so. And everyone laughed together, even Mehmed, that solemn little boy who rarely smiled, puckered his mouth into a grin and clasped my grandmother about the legs, deducing rightly that she was the cause of her happiness. Life flew back to the little house again, and there was much gaiety and good food, and my mother even sang for us, and my grandmother bellowed advice like the old autocrat she was, and the neighbours marvelled at her cleverness with the Jew dealer, and shook their heads in pity over the poor man, saying that if there were a few more of my grandmother's calibre, why the Jews of Istanbul would soon be bankrupt.